There is a kind of pain that doesn't show up on your face. You go to work, you answer messages, you laugh when someone makes a joke, you perform the rituals of a normal life, eating, sleeping, talking, existing. And somewhere beneath all of it, something is quietly breaking, not loudly, not dramatically, just a slow, persistent ache that you've learned to carry so well that most days, even you forget it's there. This is not depression in the clinical sense. This is something older, something that no diagnosis fully captures. It is the suffering of a soul that has been separated from something it cannot name, a longing without a clear object, a wound without a visible scar. 800 years ago, in the city of Baghdad, a man sat with this exact pain, not as a philosopher observing it from a distance, but as someone who had lived inside it for years. His name was Abdul Qadir Jilani, and what he discovered about human suffering was so precise, so psychologically devastating, and so spiritually liberating that it changed the inner lives of millions of people across centuries. What he knew, most people still don't understand. And that gap between what he saw and what we carry might be the reason so many of us are still exhausted. Let's begin where he began. Not with theology, not with mysticism, with hunger. Abdul Qadir Jilani arrived in Baghdad as a young man with almost nothing. He had walked from a small town in Persia. He had studied under harsh conditions. There were periods in his early life where the spiritual path he had chosen left him with no money, no status, and no certainty about where his life was going. He sat in mosques. He wandered in the desert outside the city. He fasted for days at a time, not as a performance of piety, but because there was sometimes simply nothing to eat. And in that physical emptiness, something strange began to happen. He started to notice that the suffering he felt wasn't only about food. It wasn't only about poverty or uncertainty or the frustration of a young man trying to find his place. The suffering had a texture to it, a shape. It seemed to be telling him something. Most of us, when we feel pain, try to escape it. We pick up our phones. We distract ourselves with conversation, with plans, with entertainment, with anything that creates enough noise to drown out the signal. Jilani did the opposite. He sat with it. He paid attention to it the way you'd pay attention to something speaking in a language you're just beginning to learn. And what he heard, what began to emerge from that deep interior listening, was this. Almost all human suffering is rooted in a single misunderstanding. A misunderstanding so fundamental, so quietly embedded in the way we experience ourselves, that we've built entire identities around it without ever questioning it. The misunderstanding is this: we believe we are the center of our own story. That sounds simple, maybe even obvious, but stay with it for a moment, because this is where things get psychologically precise in a way that might feel uncomfortably familiar. When you're anxious, really anxious, the kind that sits in your chest at 2 in the morning and won't let you sleep, what is the anxiety actually about? Trace it back. Follow the thread. Almost always, beneath the specific worry, beneath the story about a relationship or a career or a fear of being judged, there is something even more fundamental. The fear that you are not enough. The fear that the story of your life will not turn out the way it should. The fear that you, specifically you, will be left behind, forgotten, exposed, or diminished. This is what Jilani called the nafs, but not in the dry theological way that word is sometimes used. He described it as the part of you that has made itself into a god, the part that insists it must be protected, validated, elevated, preserved, the part that takes everything personally because everything in its framework is about it. And here is what is so precise about his observation. This is not a moral failing. It's not something to be ashamed of. It is, in his view, the default condition of being human. We arrive in this world as separate, vulnerable creatures. We develop a self to survive, and somewhere in that process of survival, the self quietly promotes itself from passenger to driver, from character to narrator, from creation to creator, and then the suffering begins. Not immediately, that's the thing. The suffering doesn't begin right away. In your 20s, perhaps, you can outrun it. You fill the space with ambition, with romantic love, with the intoxicating feeling of becoming. The nafs is powerful, and it gives you energy. It tells you, achieve more, acquire more, become more, and the emptiness will finally be filled. So you do. You work toward the life you were told would satisfy you, and some of it is genuinely beautiful, some of it is real. But there comes a moment, it comes for almost everyone, in different forms, where you have gotten some of what you wanted, and the hunger is still there, where the relationship that was supposed to complete you reveals its limitations, where the success that was supposed to quiet the anxiety just moves the anxiety to a different address. Jilani described this moment as a gift. He called it a kind of divine mercy that the world refuses to fully satisfy us. Because if it could satisfy us, if we could actually find permanent peace in status, in love, in belonging, in being admired, we would never look deeper. We would live and die on the surface of our own lives, and the depth that exists within us would remain completely unexplored. The frustration, in other words, is not the obstacle to awakening. The frustration is the invitation. But here is where his teaching becomes something unusual, something that separates him from the conventional spiritual advice of his era and, honestly, from most of the self-help content we consume today. Jilani did not say, suppress your pain. He did not say, perform gratitude until the darkness passes. He did not say, the suffering is an illusion, transcend it. He said something stranger and more demanding than any of that. He said, go deeper into it. There is a story told about him, and whether it is historically precise or spiritually metaphorical almost doesn't matter, because its truth is unmistakable. He once said that for years, whenever he felt spiritual dryness, the compulsion was to perform more prayer, more fasting, more spiritual exercise, as if the emptiness could be filled by adding things to it. And then one night, in a state of complete interior silence, he felt directed inward. Not upward, not outward, inward, into the very center of the emptiness he had been trying to escape. And in that center, he found something he had not expected. He found presence. This is the part that requires a certain kind of stillness to understand, because it doesn't translate easily into logical terms. We tend to think of our inner darkness, our anxiety, our loneliness, our grief, our spiritual emptiness, as places where God is absent. As evidence of some kind of spiritual failure, you feel disconnected, hollow, numb, and the mind interprets that as, something is wrong with me, I have drifted, I have failed, I am far. Jilani's insight was almost the reverse of this. He suggested that the very intensity of the longing, the ache, the hollow feeling, the inexplicable sadness that seems to have no cause, was not evidence of absence, it was evidence of proximity. It was the soul responding to something real but unseen, the way a compass needle vibrates more intensely as it approaches a magnetic pole. The Quran speaks of this in a way that, if you've only heard it as a recited verse without sitting inside it, might not have its full impact. We are closer to him than his jugular vein. Not closer than the sky is to the earth, closer than the blood moving through your own neck as you read these words. The intimacy being described there is not poetic exaggeration, it is a cosmological claim about the nature of your inner life. Jilani read that verse not as comfort theology, but as a psychological map. If the divine is that close, then the suffering that arises in the depths of the self is not a barrier to God. It is a doorway. Now let's bring this into something you might have felt recently. Have you ever had a moment, maybe in the middle of a perfectly ordinary day, where a wave of inexplicable sadness passes through you, where for no specific reason you feel the weight of your own existence, where you look at your life from the outside and feel a distance from it, as if you are watching yourself play a role you didn't fully choose? That feeling has a name in Sufi psychology. It is called huzn, a grief that is not about any particular loss, but about the condition of being a soul in a world that can never fully be home. In modern culture, we pathologize this feeling. We treat it as something to be fixed. We scroll past it, medicate it, spiritually bypass it with toxic positivity, or shame ourselves for feeling it when we have so much to be grateful for. Jilani's position was radical by comparison. This grief is sacred. This grief is intelligent. This grief is the soul's way of remembering that it comes from somewhere, and that where it comes from is not here. He was not romanticizing suffering. He was not saying, stay miserable and call it holiness. He was saying something more precise. If you run from this feeling, you will spend your entire life running. But if you turn to face it, if you learn to breathe inside it rather than escape from it, it will reveal something about your nature that nothing else can teach you. There is a concept he returned to repeatedly in his teachings, a concept that sounds simple but carries enormous psychological weight: surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, not the surrender of someone who has given up, the surrender of someone who has finally stopped fighting a war they were never meant to win. Here is what that war looks like in real life. You are trying to control how people perceive you. You are trying to manage the outcomes of situations that are genuinely beyond your control. You are trying to make sense of a grief that doesn't have a rational explanation. You are trying to feel worthy without fully understanding what would make you worthy. You are exhausted not because your life is objectively unbearable, but because you are spending an enormous amount of interior energy trying to hold everything together, trying to be enough, trying to make the uncertainty stop. That expenditure of energy, that constant interior labor, is what Jilani was pointing at when he talked about the prison of the nafs. Not a prison of stone, a prison of effort, a prison that you have been maintaining with both hands. Surrender, in his understanding, was the moment of releasing those hands. Not releasing responsibility, not releasing love or care or engagement with the world. Releasing the grip, the white-knuckled insistence that you can think your way out of being human, the exhausting performance of having it all together, the quiet pretense that you are managing fine when something inside you is desperate for permission to simply be witnessed by something larger than your own judgment. He described this moment differently in different contexts. Sometimes he spoke of it as a kind of death, the death of the self that has been constructed around fear and need and the desperate requirement to be validated. Sometimes he spoke of it as a birth, the emergence of something quieter and more durable beneath all the noise. But what strikes me most about the way he described it is how completely ordinary the moment could be. It did not always come in dramatic, mystical visions. It did not always come during prayer or fasting or spiritual retreat, though all of those things mattered. It could come in a moment of total exhaustion, when you have simply run out of the energy to keep pretending. It could come sitting alone in your room at the end of a day, when nothing catastrophic happened, but you feel crushed by the invisible weight of your own unlived life. In that moment of collapse, when the performance has temporarily stopped and the stillness descends, there is sometimes a presence that becomes perceptible, not thunderous, not dramatic, quiet, like something that has been waiting patiently just behind the noise. This is what Jilani spent his life pointing toward. Not a system, not a doctrine, not a 5-step method for spiritual optimization. A presence, available in the moments when we are most broken, because those are the moments when we are most genuinely open. Al-Ghazali, who walked a similar path a generation before Jilani, wrote something that maps onto this with unsettling precision. He described the human heart as a mirror, and he said, the mirror becomes clouded not primarily by sin, in the way people usually interpret that, but by distraction, by the constant outward turning of the attention toward things that stimulate but do not nourish, by the noise of ambition and comparison, and the restless seeking of stimulation that leaves the inner world progressively dimmer. We know this feeling. We live inside it every day. The phone in your pocket is a perfect symbol of it, not because technology is evil, but because it represents the extraordinary ease with which we can now fill every moment of potential interior silence with external input. Every pause, every quiet moment, every instance of inner discomfort, we have trained ourselves to immediately reach for something that will relieve the feeling of having to be alone with ourselves. Jilani's prescription for this, translated into honest human terms, is almost confrontational in its simplicity. Stop feeding the distraction. Not permanently, not through rigid self-denial, but begin, slowly, to choose the discomfort of inner silence over the comfort of outer noise. Not because silence is pleasant, it often isn't at first, but because the mirror cannot show you what you're looking for while it remains covered. There is one more dimension of his teaching on suffering that rarely gets discussed, and I want to stay with it because I think it might be the most practically important of all. Jilani taught extensively about the suffering that comes from other people, from betrayal, from rejection, from being misunderstood by those you love, from the particular grief of giving someone your trust and having them handle it carelessly. He did not spiritually bypass this pain. He did not say, "Rise above it. They don't know better. Send them love and move on." He acknowledged, with what feels like genuine emotional intelligence, that this kind of wound is among the deepest a person can carry. That the pain of being unseen by someone who should have seen you, a parent, a spouse, a friend, a community, is not small. It is enormous, and it echoes. But he located the deepest source of this pain, not in the other person's action, but in a vulnerability that precedes it. The vulnerability of having needed them to see you in the first place, of having placed your sense of self-worth into the hands of another human being who was, inevitably, limited, distracted, and carrying their own unseen wounds. This is not blame. It's not a suggestion that your pain is your fault. It is a reorientation. Because as long as the wound lives in the space between you and the person who created it, you are permanently dependent on them for healing. The healing can only come when you begin, gently, over time, without forcing it, to move the wound to a different relationship. A relationship with something that cannot betray you because it has no separate agenda. Something that is not located outside you, waiting to be won over, but is, as that verse says, closer than your jugular vein. This is what makes Jilani's understanding of suffering genuinely different from most frameworks we inherit, whether psychological or religious. He didn't ask people to become less feeling. He asked them to feel more accurately, to trace the feeling to its actual source rather than its apparent one. To follow the grief past the person who triggered it, past the event that crystallized it, all the way back to the original longing, and to recognize in that longing not a wound, but a direction. The longing itself is the compass, the pain itself is the pointer, and the place it is pointing toward has never been external. Not in the approval of another person, not in the achievement of a goal, not in the resolution of circumstances. The place it is pointing toward is interior, and it is present, and it has been present every moment of your life, waiting with a patience that makes human waiting look impatient. Near the end of his life, Abdul Qadir Jilani reportedly said something that has stayed with me in the way that only sentences that feel personally addressed can stay with you. He said, "I searched for myself and found only God. I searched for God and found only myself." That is not a theological riddle. That is a psychological map of where suffering leads when you follow it honestly. All the way, without turning back, without numbing yourself, without insisting that the pain means something has gone wrong. What it leads to is not an absence of self. It leads to a self that is no longer at war with its own existence. A self that has stopped trying to be more than it is and discovered, in that very stopping, that what it actually is was always enough. Not because it earned it, but because what it actually is was never separate from the source of enoughness in the first place. And so, I want to leave you with something that is not a conclusion, but an opening. Somewhere in your life right now, there is a suffering you have been managing, carrying carefully, keeping functional. You have built systems around it, habits that keep it contained, relationships where certain rooms stay locked. You have learned to live with it, the way people learn to live with chronic pain. Adjusting your posture around it, not quite forgetting it, but learning not to notice. What Jilani knew is that this management, however necessary it has felt, is not the destination. That inside the locked room, behind the pain you have been so careful not to fully feel, there is something waiting. Not more darkness, not collapse, something else. Something that the mystics across traditions have tried to name in hundreds of different ways, and never quite succeeded, because it is not the kind of thing that yields to description. It yields to presence, to stillness, to the terrifying and beautiful act of finally turning toward the thing you have been moving away from. You don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to have a dramatic moment of spiritual rupture. You only have to begin, slowly, imperfectly, with all your doubts still fully intact, to stop running. The door has always been there. It is located exactly where the pain is. What part of this landed most deeply for you? Has there been a moment in your own life where following the pain inward led you somewhere unexpected? I'd genuinely like to know. Sonnet 4.6